While most take for granted the epistemological supremacy of rational scientific certainty, pataphysics counters with hypothetical uncertainty. It asks the questions, why believe in truth? Why not believe in untruth? Why does belief in either case take itself so seriously? Why does belief, in effect, believe in itself? And why not move from the deceit of truth to the truth of deceit? In other words, it joyfully offers the middle finger to convention, and it blows raspberries in the general direction of tradition. It critiques the limits of both inductive and deductive reasoning by utilizing radical methodologies unconducive to explanation. Through an anarchic perspective that the Dadaists would later intensify into a full-blown program, using a kind of dream logic that the Surrealists would later hone into a full-blown revolution. But unlike these other more recognizable avant-garde movements like Dadaism and Surrealism, pataphysics never proposed itself as a movement or published a manifesto. Instead, it was a kind of artistic theoretical proposition, which then seemed to intrigue or inspire other avant-garde movements. So we could sort of think about pataphysics perhaps as a kind of subterranean intensity that sort of bubbles, perhaps rhizomatically, in conjunction with these other movements. And so at the time of its creation, there was no group affiliation, no meetings, no publications, no art showings. It was just Jari. And much later, in the years directly following World War II, a group of writers and artists, including Umberto Eco and Jean Baudrillard and Arabal and Ionesco and Quinu and even Groucho Marx, created the College of Pataphysics. As the experimental writer Stuart Home puts it, while rarely viewed as a fan club, the College of Pataphysics was often seen as an overextended joke. The college was neither an organized art movement nor an alternative education institution, and yet many of the avant-garde's leading figures came to join. So it has this sort of interesting space that it hovers in. At this juncture, as Roger Shattuck puts it in his introduction to this special issue of the Evergreen Review dedicated to pataphysics, we have now reached the point where it is necessary to undertake the self-contradictory task of defining pataphysics in non-pataphysical terms. Jari halfway defines it in Book 2 of his Exploits and Opinions of Dr. Faustrow under the title Elements of Pataphysics, but the whole thing is sort of herky-jerky. It's very convulsive. It sort of starts and stops, and so he begins down sort of he follows one sort of line of flight, only to be broken off. The flow stops in another line of flight, and so it's very Lewisian. So he says here, so pataphysics is the science of that which is superinduced upon metaphysics, whether within or beyond the latter's limitation, extending as far beyond metaphysics as the latter extends beyond physics. For example, an epiphenomenon being often accidental, pataphysics will be, above all, the science of the particular, despite the common opinion that the only science is that of the general. So pataphysics will examine the laws governing exceptions, and will explain the universe supplementary to this one, or less ambitiously, will describe a universe which can be, and perhaps should be, envisioned in place of the traditional one, since the laws that are supposed to have been discovered in the traditional universe are also correlations of exceptions, albeit more frequent ones, but in any case, accidental data which, reduced to the status of unexceptional exceptions, possesses no longer even the virtue of originality. Then, after this sort of long-ass definition, Jari simplifies it to a single sentence by claiming, pataphysics is the science of imaginary solutions, which symbolically attributes the properties of objects described by their virtuality to their lineaments. So it's sort of funny that he goes on forever and then he sort of chops it, and neither really get at the heart of it, because there is no heart. There is no there. Before ending the chapter mid-sentence without conclusion, Jari offers a few brief and strange examples meant to illustrate the concept, the most interesting of which has to do with a kind of perspectivism regarding a child who draws a clock as a circle and a house as a square. The child who conceives of the clock as round and the house as square, according to Jari, has been conditioned to make this connection, despite the fact that, as Jari reminds us, a clock appears in profile as a narrow rectangular construction, and a house observed in profile appears as an oblique trapezoid. Representing a clock as a narrow rectangular construction or a house as an oblique trapezoid, however, confuses the transmission of information and requires a sort of imaginative, experimental approach to semiotics, as well as a revaluation of the necessity for consensus and the necessity of reduction to the general and the acceptable modes of thinking. Here again, we see a nod in the direction of Nietzsche. In fact, the Canadian experimental poet and scholar Christian Book, who, Book B with the umlaut over the O and the K, he's actually the author of the only full-length English language critical examination of pataphysics, which is interesting. He identifies pataphysics as the ludic counterpart to Nietzschean philosophy, explicitly connecting the pataphysical project to Nietzsche's conception of perspectivism. He says, like Nietzsche, Book argues, Jari suggests through pataphysics that reality does not exist, except as the interpretive projection of a phenomenal perspective, which is to say that reality is never as it is, but always as if it is. Such heightened skepticism seems to resonate loudly with much of Deleuze's intellectual preoccupations, from Hume on down the line. So when we learn that Book's exploration hovers on the intersection of science and poetry by focusing our attention on those aspects of pataphysics that valorize exceptional singularity, anomaly, surprise, and the seemingly arbitrary, or what Book calls the accepted case versus the expected case, or the sporadic accident versus the periodic incident, certain connections between Jari and Deleuze become more clear. Specifically, to offer one example, I think we see a direct connection arising from the crux of the pataphysical project, because in it, what is at stake is the status of poetry in a world of science. How might poetry reclaim its own viable truth? And sort of vice versa, how might science benefit from its own poetic irony?